Hello everyone, this is Pastor Dirk, and today we begin a new class called Who Wrote the Bible? Over the next several weeks, we're going to look at a number of chapters in the history, so to speak. Places in history, evidence in history that show how these books came together. These books we know collectively as the one larger book, the Bible. And this story really has two parts. And they develop kind of independently, and then sometimes they cross over with one another. We'll start with the first part, the Old Testament story. And then later in the course, we'll look at the New Testament story. Now, I've called part one Old Testament witnesses. And that word witnesses is true on at least two levels. On one level, we're going to be looking at historic witnesses. In other words, how do these books come together over time? What does history say about how these books were recognized and why they were recognized? And the second level of witness is this. Sometimes there's a theory out there that folks kind of sat together in a room somewhere and decided which books should be in the Bible. And that's really not how things developed. This is really a case of people witnessing what God is doing. They're observing how God is revealing himself. And so they're a witness to the work of God in how these books come together. And so we want to look at both aspects of the story. So today we're going to start with some introductory concepts, get a little bit into the story, and then we'll pick it up in our next session. So let me kick it off with an introduction. We start with this quote from an interesting historian by the name of Josephus. Josephus was born shortly after the death of Jesus. Interesting character. For part of his life fought against Rome and its influence there in Israel, and especially in Jerusalem. But then later kind of switched sides and became a liaison, so to speak, a political attaché or advisor to the Roman government there in Jerusalem. And in that very complicated role of trying to bring peace and stand in the gap, he has some interesting things to say, and he writes a lot of history for larger Roman audiences about what is Judaism and how does Judaism function and the logic and the rationale behind Judaism. And in one of those works against a fellow by the name of Apion, Josephus defends the Jewish faith. And one of the things he defends is its scripture. Here's a quote from that work. He says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have." Here he's talking about the mythologies, the Iliad, the Odyssey, all these Greek works that have different ideas about God and different concepts of how gods are formed and people are formed and so forth. No, he sees the Jewish scriptures as one story working together, and he says, but only 22 books which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. This tells us a couple things. By this century, the century in which Jesus lived, there's a consensus among the Jewish faithful that there are 22 books, that decision has already been made, and that these books are regarded to be divine, divinely inspired. So that gives us kind of a hard stop place, that certainly by the time of Jesus, the Old Testament is deciding. This is one among many witnesses to that fact. I just chose Josephus because it's one of the clearest indicators. So we're sure at one level, at least by the time of Jesus, there is this idea that the books are closed. That is, the books have been decided for the Old Testament. So where does this come from? Where does it start? Well, let's look at a couple introductory concepts, and then we'll kind of dig into the history a little bit. One idea that we should get a hold of is the idea that this is Jewish scripture, all right? What we call the Old Testament, the Jewish writers call the Tanakh. It's the holy scriptures for the Jewish faith. It is the whole Bible for followers of the Jewish faith. They use this word Tanakh. It's kind of a word that represents all the sections. And there are three major sections in the Jewish scriptures. One is the Torah, or the Torah. The law, we would call it the law of Moses. It's the first 5 books. The Navi, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And you can see that the Hebrew letters used there, which we put into English letters, it has these letters that in English are T, N, and K, and that's kind of how those words come together, and we get this English kind of transliteration of this word Tanakh. And you put the numbers together, and you get somewhere between 22 and 24 books, and that kind of depends upon how the books are counted. I'll explain that in a moment. So first we have kind of the Tanakh, the Torah, and you kind of need to see the Tanakh as almost like a pyramid. At the bottom are the foundation stones. The Tanakh, or the Torah, the 5 books of the law, everything rests on these. These are the revelation of God's will to Moses. The other books build on top of this foundation. You can see that the 5 books of the Torah are equivalent with the 5 books we call the Pentateuch or the Law of Moses. So that's about the same. The prophets are a little different than Navi. They're numbered slightly differently. That's the same material for the most part, just numbered differently. You can see Joshua and Judges, Samuel, Kings, those are all considered prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. The books are not divided. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, whereas in the Hebrew Scriptures it's one book of Samuel and Kings. The other major difference is that whereas we have 12 individual prophets, minor prophets, they call them the 12 prophets. It's one book called the 12. And so put together there are 9 books here, rather than we would have a smaller group of prophets. And lastly, the Ketuvim are the writings. These are what's left. They would be equivalent to what we see in the Psalms and the Proverbs of Job, the wisdom literature, we call it. Ruth is sometimes included with the Ketuvim or the writings. Sometimes it's included with Joshua, so it's combined into one book. And sometimes Lamentation is combined with Jeremiah. And that's how you get, sometimes in some lists, there are 9 Ketuvim writings, sometimes 11, depending on whether those books are combined. The other thing I want you to notice here, that in Hebrew Scriptures, the last book of the Bible is Chronicles. We would call it 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's one book here in the Hebrew Scriptures. And you'll see that sometimes in the Old Testament. In Luke 11, for example, Jesus talks about how people have been trying to kill prophets from Adam all the way to Zechariah. And Zechariah is in that last chapter of Chronicles. So you can see that Jesus is thinking about the Jewish Scriptures when he's talking about from the beginning to the end, right? From Genesis all the way to Chronicles. So that's the Hebrew Scriptures here put in this way. So this is, we just need to keep in mind when we read in the New Testament about the Scriptures, we're looking back to these Hebrew writings. That is the Scriptures for them. That is the Bible for them. Keep in mind that when Paul's writing his letters, the Gospels have not been written yet. And so when he talks about Scripture, when Paul talks about Scripture, he's talking about what we would call the Old Testament Scriptures. So that was their starting place. So I just wanted you to see this, this setting of writings. Now, if you do an analysis, what you realize is that these 22 or 24 books that are in the Tanakh are equivalent to the 39 books that we have in our English Bibles. They are the same, they're just numbered differently. So that's one part of the introduction to understand this word Tanakh in the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what we're talking about. That's where those numbers come from. Now, the other scripture, the other term I want to talk about for a moment is this word canon. Now, sometimes when we talk about Scripture, we talk about the canon of Scripture. What do we mean by that term? Well, it's a Christian word equivalent to the Tanakh, this listing. The Christian word canon comes from this ancient reed that was used as a ruler. And I think this picture here, I couldn't find one of a Hebrew ruler. I think this is an Egyptian one, but you get the idea. They were reed sticks used as rulers. But what happens then is over time, this ruler is kind of applied in a larger sense to a rule that oversees faith and practice, the other idea of a measuring. And so it applies to the rule of faith and practice, and eventually the book of rules. Which rules, which books, which standards should be applied, which books should be included. And the first time we see that mentioned in Christian literature is by this fellow Athanasius. Athanasius is a very interesting fellow, was very influential, very much a part of the Nicene Creed when they were arguing against the Arian controversy, was very involved in that. And he wrote this letter in Easter of 367, in which we see the first kind of use of this word canon. Let me show you that quote. He says, "It seemed good to me also, having been urged thereto by true brethren, and having learned from the beginning, to set before you the books included in the canon, and handed down and accredited as divine." So you see, this writing comes some 267, almost 300 years after Josephus. But this is a Christian statement now. But he uses similar words, the idea that these books have been fixed. And what's interesting, if you read this whole context, and it's easily available on the internet, I give you the reference here, you could go out and look it up, and you can see that the books he lists are essentially the same as the books listed by Josephus all those 300 years earlier. Numbered differently, of course. The only slight difference is this idea of Esther. Esther, because the name of God is not mentioned in Esther, sometimes it appears in lists and doesn't appear in other lists of the Old Testament. Sometimes numbers are grouped a little differently. Jeremiah has another couple additions to it in Athanasius' list, but generally speaking, they're very much the same. It's just interesting that from a Jewish perspective, around the time of Jesus to now some 300 years later, the Christian list is roughly the same of these Old Testament books. So what that tells us is there is a unanimity. Athanasius worked all the way over here in Alexandria in Egypt, far from Jerusalem. And so this was not just a local Jerusalem thing. This was something that had expanded throughout first the Greek Empire, later the Roman Empire. This is something that expanded over time. And this is just a witness to us on these two other ends, hundreds of years apart, different parts of that known empire, that there's an agreement, even between Jewish people and Christian people, who by this point did not see eye to eye on a lot of things, but even they saw eye to eye on what the scriptures were at this particular time. I find that incredibly important historic witness. Lastly, I'll just point out this text by F.F. Bruce called the Canon of Scripture. Sometimes I'm asked, is there a book I can get a hold of? And F.F. Bruce is just a genius. He's one of the foremost historic Bible scholars. I found this book to be the most informative, easy to grasp. It's not written in academia, so you couldn't understand some sort of academic diatribe that you can't understand. It's written in very plain English, but from a very accomplished scholar. And so if you're looking for an in-depth study of some of the topics we're talking about here, I would recommend it. And I did go out and look on the internet. You know, I always prefer people that have passed on but have left a legacy. If you're still reading the book after they're gone, that means it's pretty important stuff. So F.F. Bruce left us a lot of really wise material when it comes to the development of Scripture. So I'd recommend, if you're looking for more detail, to jump into that. So those are some introductory concepts. First, the Tanakh and the canon. Let me say something else about timeline. We'll talk later about manuscripts and documents and how we know that these copies turned out well. But before we get started, I thought it might be helpful to put in perspective the time period that we're talking about. Basically, the Old Testament is written in this time period here between Moses and the years sometimes that we attribute to Moses. They vary depending upon the kind of the way you read the historical record, but it's somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BC. I kind of err on the side of 1400. I think that's probably the better dates for Moses. And Malachi is the last prophet that wrote. And so from a time perspective, you're talking about 1,000 years. So the scriptures themselves were written in this kind of 1,000-year period. Prior to Moses, you have other events. The one that we can kind of date is Abraham, and the guess there, a good guess, is somewhere around 2000 BC. Prior to that, there's a lot of debate about how you go from Abraham back to creation. That's a separate class for a separate day. But fairly concretely, we can know that Abraham around 2000. And the idea here is that Moses was called upon to put whatever that oral tradition is, and maybe some of it written, we're not sure, but whatever it was, by the time he comes along, he is the one that records this previous history to himself and puts it down in writing in these 5 books called the Torah or the Law of Moses, depending upon which tradition you come from. So he writes, and it's for 1,000 years, the story unfolds of God's dealings with his people, ending with Malachi. Now, Malachi becomes the last prophet writing, and then there's some years of silence, some 400 years between the end of the prophetic writing and the New Testament starting. And so you can see that it's very important then in the New Testament that when John the Baptist comes as a prophet, this is a big event. People have been waiting for a prophet for 4 centuries. So when John the Baptist comes announcing the Messiah, you can kind of get a feel of why that was such a dramatic event. People have been waiting for a prophet. There has been no prophet. And so whenever a prophet appeared, there's a debate and a controversy. Is God speaking again? Is God moving again? So I thought it might be helpful for you to see this timeline. This is the place we're talking. And the key is right here, this year 400 BC. This is about when Malachi writes, somewhere in that area. And so the question is, how do we get from this idea of 400 BC to the list that Josephus talks about in 96 and later even Athanasius talks about in 367? What develops from the close of this writing to the place where we now have some 500 years later, we have an agreed upon list already that people are respecting? What can we find out in that gap about how the scripture came together? So that's kind of what we're going to do through the rest of this part, the rest of this talk. So let's go on then. And before we get into the history itself, I do want to talk a little bit about Hebrew as a written language. I realize that some of you may have been watching this video, maybe haven't been exposed to the Hebrew language. So let me just make a couple comments about that before we get into the story. I recorded here the opening words in the book of Genesis, Bereshith bara Elohim. You'll notice that unlike English, it reads from left to right, Hebrew reads from right to left, so it reads in this direction, right? And the other thing you'll notice here is that there are little pointings here. There are no vowels per se in the original Hebrew language. These little points are placed in here as vowels, and they come along later in the development. We'll talk about that a little later. But that's kind of how we know how to pronounce some of these words because of these vowel points that later scholars inserted. So this is just the text for in the beginning, the word for create here, and then this word Elohim. It's one of the words for God, the common name for God. And so that's how the text opens. Now, the reason I want to mention this is for some reason, even at this point in history, people have a little confusion about Hebrew as a written language. When did all this get started? The biblical claim is that Moses is the one that wrote all this stuff. So we're in that 1400 BC, 1200 BC area. And throughout those first 5 books, you see several times this direct command from God, write it down. Write it down. 16 times Moses or someone else in this Pentateuch, God says, write these things down. So clearly the biblical claim is that these things are being written. So it's not a factor that later on people got together compared notes and tried to remember and wrote things down, that these were later writings. No. The text itself is claiming that writing was happening all along. Moses himself and others getting involved. In fact, twice, you remember, God himself writes. A couple times, it talks about how God himself wrote those first tablets of the commandments. And so writing was very much a part of the biblical claim of Moses from the very beginning. Now, I bring that up because that became an issue of debate, especially in the 1800s, late 1800s, into the early 1900s, and in fact still today. When were these books actually written, especially the early books of Moses? Were they written at the time of Moses, or were they written down later by other people? One of the early claims in the late 1800s is that, well, they had to have been written by later people because there was no such thing as a written version of Hebrew at this point. But here's what one scholar has to say about that. A scholar by the name of R.K. Harrison, he says very clearly, contrary to the contentions of Wellhausen. Now, Wellhausen was one of the founders of this critical movement in the late 1800s. He's the one given credit, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about it a little bit later in this course. But he's one of the ones who founded that movement that basically set aside the biblical contention that the writing took place at the time of Moses and started to argue that really no, the Pentateuch was put together later on by a bunch of editors who kind of cobbled together different traditions and created what we now know as the law of Moses. So that he's kind of the one that started that theory. But one of the reasons he put forward for that theory is that there was no written language for the Hebrews. Now, Harrison straightens us out on this. He says, contrary to these contentions of Wellhausen, who maintained against archaeological evidence already available in his day, and obviously in the 1800s, there's no Google, we couldn't just look it up. Stuff was happening all over the world. People were finding stuff. Apparently he did not see the press releases that they were finding evidence, as we'll see shortly, that there was writing in this particular area. Wellhausen himself said that the writing did not appear among the Hebrews until the early monarchy. And here he's talking about Saul and David, 1000 BC, something like that. So his contention was, well, writing didn't occur till then how could Moses have written it? Well, as we're going to see, the historic evidence pointed out, as Harrison says here, they had means of producing written records at their disposal from very early times. And so what he's talking about historically, let me just give you a couple examples here. One is historical evidence in this Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was an ancient king in Babylon, and this stela was found, or this column, this obelisk was found in, I think 1901, something like that, early 1900s. And it's an amazing find. It lists all these laws in an ancient language, even before the time of Moses, 300 years before Moses or more, 400 years before Moses. There's laws are written down. So clearly there's an ancient written language in the same general family as Hebrew. And if you look at these laws and you study them, they bear a lot of resemblance to some of the laws in the law of Moses. Laws like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In fact, some scholars have argued that Moses took them from Hammurabi. But I think if you study them, and I've read both to place them side by side, there's enough differences to show there wasn't just this direct borrowing. But it wasn't unusual for these laws to be written in that time. And so it gives us some historical support for the fact that Moses could very much have been the author, or at least the recorder of these laws as they were given to them. There was written language and other historical evidence of those kind of laws being in existence. Another important historic find was the so-called Moabite Stone from around 830. So this would have been some 600 years after Moses, but nonetheless, very interesting recording of a Moabite event and written language at this point. And what's interesting about this Moabite stone is that the story told on it is very similar to a story that we find in 2 Kings 3 about the Israelite king Omri. It shows that there's a parallel. Now, there's some differences in the details of how the story are told, but it's obviously the same story. All that to say, what has happened in the last couple hundred years of archaeology is that these things start to emerge and start to support the idea that Scripture was written when it says it was written, and that the history it's recording is history that actually took place. Archaeology is a very interesting part of Bible study. And what I always urge when it comes to archaeology is that we be patient. A lot of claims are made early on about what did or didn't happen in biblical story. And then if you just wait long enough, some archaeological find will come along and demonstrate that the Scriptures are more accurate than what people thought they were. So whenever we find something mentioned in Scripture, there are people that aren't mentioned. For years, there was no historical evidence, for example, that Hittites existed. And then they found archaeological evidence that Hittites existed. So whenever you hear these critiques that there's a conflict between archaeology and Scripture, I just urge patience. Archaeology is not an exact science. It's always an evolving kind of art and science, and there's a lot of theory there. And if you give it enough time, pictures begin to emerge, and more times than not, Scripture turns out to be right in those things. So there is plenty of historical evidence to point out that the Bible, the story that it claims, that Moses wrote these things down, there's historical evidence out there to suggest that he could, in fact, have done that. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility. It's not illogical to make that assumption. So some introductory facts with regard to the writing of Hebrew. Well, let's do one more topic here for this session. Let's talk a little bit about something called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is, as you can tell from the term, it comes from this idea of 7 or 70, LXX, the Roman number for 70. It gets that idea because of the tradition of its origin. We'll look at that in a moment. But the reason I want to focus on it right now is it sits in that gap. Remember, we said the challenge was if Malachi wrote around 400 BC, and we have a witness here in the 1st century that these 22 books were established, how do we get from the end of the Old Testament era to these books that are being recognized as Scripture? What fills the gap? Well, what we have in that gap is a Greek translation of the Scriptures called the Septuagint. Somewhere between in that 250 era, right in the middle of that gap between 400 and 100 AD, right in the middle of that gap, about halfway between, we have this Greek translation of the Scriptures called the Septuagint. So let's talk about that for just a moment. We have these, well, historically what occurred here is, if you remember the story of Israel, at some point, around 586 BC, the Babylonians come in and they take a large number of captives out of Jerusalem into Babylon. And before that, the Assyrians had already come in and wiped out the northern section. So already you have Jewish people scattered throughout the empire. Well, that scattering continues from then on out. As the cultures develop over the next 500 years and more, Jewish people began to scatter, not just over here to the east into Babylon and Assyria and so forth. They also started moving west into the Greek Empire. And a large collection of Jewish people gathered in this Greek city called Alexandria in northern Africa, in an area we now know as Egypt. A large, strong Jewish group. This word here, diaspora, it talks about the scattering of the Jewish people all over the Greek and later the Roman Empire. Well, what so often happens when a number of people leave from the center of Palestine and come over here to this section of Alexandria, what happens is, as one generation kind of follows after another, the second, third, fourth generation, all of a sudden Hebrew, the language that they grew up with, was not their native language. Now they spoke the Greek language, like all the children around them, and that was the language of business. And so Hebrew becomes less and less of a well-known subject in these synagogues scattered throughout the empire. And so in Alexandria, there was a long strong literary tradition to preserve the writings of these various folks, a strong library there. And so it appears that there was a strong effort then to take the scriptures that were originally written in Hebrew and render them into Greek. In fact, the story of how they got rendered into Greek actually became a legend. And here's one summary of that legend. It's a short, concise summary of the legend that actually comes from Jewish rabbinic tradition. And I'll just read it here. Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. Remember I said it's the LXX, the 70. That's where that idea comes from, that the authors are these 72 elders. And he placed them in 72 chambers. So it was the Egyptian king wanting to preserve this, the Egyptian leader wanting to preserve this. So he took 72 Jewish elders and he brought them to Alexandria. That's the story. He placed them into 72 separate rooms, and each of them in a separate one without revealing to them why they were summoned. And then after he put them in the rooms, he says he entered each one room and he says, "Write for me the Torah of Moses, your teacher." The law. It says God put it in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. And so this idea that they each went into their room separately and miraculously, divinely, they went into their room without being told what they were going to do. They got in there. King said, translate the laws of Moses. And then when they each came out, miraculously, divinely, they did word for word this Greek translation agreed. And so the claim was that this Greek translation was just as good as the Hebrew translation. It was also a divine product. That was the legend. That was the belief. Obviously, there's some questions about that, how accurate that is. But that's how we get this word Septuagint. Now, the facts of it beneath the legend are still astonishing. That not just the law of Moses, but all the scriptures get translated into Greek. So which scriptures? Who's doing the translating? Which books are they selecting? Well, what we find is it is the Tanakh. It is the five of the Torah, the Navi, the Ketuvim. Those Jewish scriptures are the ones that get translated. So by this 250, 200, 150, these books are the ones from Hebrew that are translated. So by this point in time, clear over here in Alexandria now, clear over here where later Athanasius would be from this area, already by this time, the books are being accepted as the divinely inspired book. So much so that there's this desire for the Greeks, when they're translating, to make the point that their version is just as inspired as the original. So that's an incredibly strong historic witness to how carefully these books were respected and revered at this point. And let's look at the significance of these books. The first have to do a witness to earlier periods. Now remember I said that Moses could have been written and according to the Bible was written, the laws of Moses were pretty much written over 1,000 years earlier. And those must have been carefully preserved all the way from that time through Babylonian captivity. We're talking 1,000 years of very careful collection and maintaining of those. Those books have been revered for a long period of time. And as well as then the prophets and also of even as late as Malachi 400. So what this tells us, earlier periods, all the time of captivity, all the time of being in Babylon, there's this strong scholarly recording commitment. A lot of effort went into all that time preserving these books because they were believed the whole time, to the point that by the time the Greeks go to translate it all these years later, these are the books they still have. So this gives us insight into that earlier period, that for some period of time, a long period of time, these works were preserved and treasured and regarded for a long period of time as divine works. Now, there are some interesting distinctions from this Greek version from the original Hebrew version. A couple of the most important distinctions, one has to do with the revised order. Now, when we're talking about Hebrew scriptures, we're talking about scrolls, and they get put in piles, and they get kind of whichever pile you need, you get that scroll. Well, when you put it into a book, you got to have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. You got to put things in order. And when the Septuagint gets put in order, the prophets get put last in that. You have the Torah, then the Ketuvim, and then the prophets get put last in this book. And so the last book, in kind of a sort of historic way, Malachi becomes the last book. And it's really this Greek order that becomes the basis later for Christian translations. So the translation into Latin, the translations into the other languages later, into English. So in our English Bibles, the order that we get, by and large, follows the Septuagint, not the original Hebrew. And it's because Greek is the language that most Christians understood. That's what most Christians followed. And so that becomes the standard order of the books, not the books as you find them in the Tanakh. But it's interesting to go back and read them in the order that the Tanakh has it. It's a different experience. But I just wanted you to be aware that that's where we get the revised order of the books. Now, there's also a significant difference in these books called the Septuagint Plus. In Protestant circles, sometimes they're called the Apocrypha. There's a collection of books that are added to the collection of scriptures, and they start to appear together. These books are from the period in between the last, remember I said that years of silence from 400 where Malachi stops writing. In that gap between that end and no prophets, there are other books being written, other wisdom literature, other histories, and so forth. And so what was starting to happen when this Greek translation of the Torah was put together and those collections started to be assembled for the library, these other books that were instructive, that were spiritual, that fed into the life of Judaism, they were kind of collected together. And so when these Greek versions began to put together, these books were kind of included among them. The challenge came later when the Christians went to translate this. The key figure there is an early church scholar by the name of Jerome. And when he comes together and he starts translating the Bible into Latin, there's this big controversy, this big discussion about whether those extra books, that Septuagint Plus, should be included as part of the scriptures. Most people at that time understood that they were not part of the scriptures. They were additional books. They're good to read. They have some good kind of moral lessons in them, but they're not inspired. They weren't viewed as the same level. However, so many people had got used to them. So many people accepted them, included them as part of their tradition, that by the time Jerome goes to write or do the Latin translation, he gets a lot of pressure. Even though he is not that happy about having to include these books, he gets a lot of pressure from folks to include them in his official version of the Bible. And so he does. And throughout most of the Roman Catholic Church, the early history, they were kept as part of the scriptures. Not everybody read the scriptures, but the ones that did, it was kind of kept there. But it was pretty much understood that this collection of scriptures, or this collection of writings, they were there, but they were, we call them deuterocanonical. They were second level. They weren't canonical. They weren't part of the canon, but they were kind of on a second level. The problem, however, is when the Protestants began to make their translations of the scriptures, they wanted to go back to the original. So when they started to go from the Latin and started to produce the German versions and the English versions and the French versions and these other versions of the scripture, when they started to do that, they were kind of children of the Reformation and the Renaissance, and they wanted to go back to the sources. And so they went all the way back and they said, look, these are not part of the scripture. They've never been part of the scripture. Everybody knows they're not part of the scripture. And so their translations did not include this Septuagint Plus, or what we come to know as the Apocrypha. It wasn't part of the original, so they just didn't put it in the Bible. Well, unfortunately, because of the contentious nature that period, the Roman Catholic Church pushed back, and at the council, the 16th century Council of Trent came back and said, no, you have to accept those books. In fact, they went further. They said, if you don't accept these books as part of the Bible, you're anathema, you're cursed, you're condemned. So they kind of went the other way and really pressed on this subject. And so it created this chasm that you're either on one side or the other. The traditional Catholic, 16th century Catholic view that these were part of the Bible, or the Protestant view that they definitely were not part of the Bible. Well, since we've kind of come back to where we always started, both on the Protestant side and on the Catholic side, there's this realization that these books have been around for a long time, but they never have been considered part of the Scripture. They're continued to be included in Catholic Bibles. Even some Protestant Bibles have them, but most Protestant Bibles don't. So that's kind of a short thumbnail of where those other books came from. It goes all the way back to this Greek translation of the Scriptures we know as the Septuagint. And the last point I want to make here is that for most Christians in the early Christian era, this was the Bible. Obviously, the writers of the New Testament themselves, they were all from this area of Jerusalem and Israel. They knew Hebrew. They spoke Hebrew. So the writers of the New Testament knew Hebrew. But once you get outside of that, into the surrounding areas, those first century Christians, second century, and certainly as you get into the third century, fourth century, the Christians, they didn't read Hebrew. And so for them, the scriptures were these Greek scriptures, the Greek translations, whether we call them the Septuagint, sometimes they're more generically called the Greek translations. And by the way, there were other translations. There's the Samaritan version, and there's other versions of the Old Testament as well, or the Hebrew scriptures. They're around. I don't have time to talk about those. But the Greek one was the one that was most known in the Greek and later the Roman Empire. So these were the scriptures. In fact, we're getting ready for Sunday. We're going to do a talk on Hebrews chapter 1. And as I was reading through Hebrews again, I was reminded that so much of Hebrews is written to a group of people that you can tell from the way that the writer of Hebrews is quoting Scripture. He's quoting oftentimes from the Greek translations. And what he's seeking to do there is explain to people who were familiar with the Greek translations of Scriptures what those Scriptures were really pointing to. And getting back to the Hebrew roots and showing that for folks that maybe weren't aware of the Hebrew versions, maybe they're more aware of the Greek versions, but both versions are pointing forward to Jesus. That was his point. And so I just wanted you to be aware that that was the Bible. And keep in mind, certainly for many people outside of Israel and outside of Jerusalem, this was what they would have read as the Bible. And lastly, I'll just point out this quote. Ben Sirach, one of his books are the ones that ended up in this Apocrypha. But actually, it's interesting that he has a quote in his work. He says, "For things originally spoken Hebrew have not the same force of them when they were translated into another tongue. And not only these, but the law itself and the prophets and the rest of the books have no small difference when they were spoken in their original form." So here's somebody whose work was actually included in that Septuagint Plus is saying, look, there's nothing as good as the original. There's nothing as good as the Hebrew. These are translations. So he's kind of pushing back against that legend that says the Greek version is just as inspired as the Hebrew version. All right, well, we're going to stop there. I realize that's a lot of information to take in. We're going to pause here, and then we're going to continue. Now, again, if you want to do this interactively, where you can ask questions on Monday night, we do this on Zoom. Just send me an email at dirk@roserchurch.com, and we'll get you on the class list, and you can kind of participate. But if you can't make it to the interactive session, I'll continue to do a video version of these so you can at least have the information. And by the way, if you send me an email, I'll send you a link, and this presentation is actually out there in a link that you can get a hold of. So, all that to say, thank you very much for joining us to this first session of Who Wrote the Bible, and we'll be back very soon with the continuation of the story. Thanks for joining us.